All right. Shall we just get started?
Good evening to everybody.
Good evening.
My name is Mbata and I work for Southern Tanzania Elephant Program as Human Elephant Coexistence Manager.
And my name is Josephine Smit.
First of all, I would like to give you a short introduction about STEP. STEP is an elephant conservation program based in southern parts of Tanzania, believing in the importance of strong protected area and the welfare of people living adjacent to these protected areas. Actually, we work with a range of partners towards improving long-term security for elephants in Tanzania and beyond. In this presentation, we are going to present about the patterns of HEC in southern and central Tanzania. We are going to present our approach to HEC challenges and their success, and we are going to sum up our presentation by telling you the lesson learned from our work and our future work. Our focal area, Southern Tanzania Elephant Program, work in the Ruwa ecosystem as well as work in the Ruwa Selu ecosystem. Welcome, Josephine, to proceed with our presentation.
So just to give you a bit of context on the kinds of human-elephant interactions that we work with and try to address in south-central Tanzania. Crop damage, as in most cases, is the most widespread impact of elephants, but there are other impacts too. We have found from our work that the intensity and seasonality of crop damage to elephants does vary, and that is important to know in terms of how you design your interventions. We found as well that elephant impacts are not evenly distributed in space, so they are concentrated around certain hotspots. These tend to be, close to protected area boundaries, but also in elephant corridor areas, near rivers, especially where there's irrigation farming. And in the mountainous areas where we work, we find a funneling effect of slope and gradient, and that influences where elephants enter farms. We've done some work using camera traps to assess how many elephants are coming into farmland, how often, and what we found is in a very small area of farmland over 4 years, 48 different bulls used crops, but most of them were occasional crop users, so we only got them a few times on the camera traps. Our approach to human-elephant coexistence includes research and monitoring. That's sort of the first step, to identify elephant impacts, understand where we need to work, and also evaluate mitigation strategies. We then work with farmers to reduce crop losses to elephants through different methods that we will share with you. We invest in income-generating activities that are elephant-friendly, and we also try to increase tolerance for elephants through awareness raising. So step one is usually to conduct research surveys and follow that up with community-based monitoring using local elephant monitors. And this has been really important because, there wasn't much data before we started working here. So we really needed to understand where the priority areas were for coexistence efforts. By then training local elephant monitors using standardized methods for collecting data on elephant impact, we were able to identify at a local level where the most vulnerable areas were. And that was really important for choosing where and which interventions to implement, and also to assess their effectiveness. One challenge, of course, with relying on reporting is that it can be difficult to assess how many reports go that we don't receive. So for crop damage, we think we're getting a high number of reports, but for instance, for elephant movements, if no one is impacted, then you might not necessarily get a report. Our main method to reduce crop losses to farms is to use beehive fences. So thankfully, Esther has already told us how beehive fences work. Unlike the Elephants and Bees project, we work with farmers groups and not individual farmers. Tanzania has a culture of working with what are called community-based organizations. So these are locally registered groups that gives them a formal structure that allows them to be recognized by government, makes them eligible for loans, and We then work to construct linear fences adjacent to protected area boundaries. So not encircling farms, but linear fences. And we currently have 5 beehive fence projects, 2 adjacent to Rumba Game Reserve and 3 in the Kilombero Valley, 1 adjacent to Selous Game Reserve and 2 adjacent to Udzungwa Mountains National Park. As I said, we care a lot about testing whether these methods work. In our longest study site, we found that beehive fences have reduced elephant visits to farmland significantly, reduced the probability of a crop foraging visit by half. And in an area that used to have over 100 nights with elephant visits, in the last few years that's been between 7 and 11 visits. So it's really decreased in our study areas. One challenge with beehive fences is occupancy of beehives. There's never going to be 100% occupancy, at least not in the first few years. But we have found, similarly as Lucy King has, that there is still a deterrent effect of empty hives or dummy hives, and that's helpful because it means we can reduce the costs of beehive fences, or of building beehive fences. And another impact of beehive fences was that retaliatory and PAC killing of elephants went down after the fence was implemented.
Building beekeeping capacity and the link to high markets. In order for beehive fencing to be effective and well sustainable, STEP will always conduct comprehensive beekeeping training to farmers group, and we provide with harvesting gears to facilitate them to conduct regular monitoring of their beehive fencing project. At the same time, also we are linking farmers with good buyers of the elephant-friendly honey in order to earn more money from this project. Challenges and success and challenges in this program. The first
just the healthy bee colonies.
beekeeping success and challenges. Among the success of this project is that we still managed to train more than 100 farmers from 5 farmers groups, 3 from Udzungwa and Selous Game Reserve, and 2 farmers groups from Rumba Game Reserve. And last year, the farmers group also managed to harvest more than 160 kgs. And nowadays also we have managed also to link the farmer with lucrative markets, whereby in local market the farmer earn only $3 per kg, while in tourism camps and lodge they earn $15 per kg. So this is a big success for us. But among these successes also there are some big challenges. The challenges in this program, among them, which is the pests, disease and droughts due to the climatic change, and another problem in this program, we usually face a high abandonment rate during dry season. Also, it is our aim to buffer financial losses. It is our aim also to buffer farmers against financial losses caused by elephants, and we do this through implementing village saving and loan association. This is the group of people who stand together and receive loans from these savings. And normally they select land in the second one here, whereby the all accumulated savings and the profits are distributed back to the members. Challenges and success in this program. Viscerally, it has been a popular way for the rural farmers to get loans in their locality areas. As you know that in rural areas it is difficult for the local community to access loans in big microfinances and banks. So this is the success. And another success is that for the past 2 years the farmers group managed to great impact in the local community. It is not an easy work. But among all the challenges in this program, in VCLA, some of we faced the problem of poor participation in VCLA meetings, and at the same, it happened, but for few groups, you can find that 5% of the whole members default to pay their loans.
Do you want to say something about the interest earned on shares?
Okay, another challenge may be, it's not a big challenge, but we can see it's like a challenge. For instance, for last years, the VCLI members accumulated, actually we can say it is a moderate profit. But our plan, we would like to push the members to buy more profits in order to earn more. We will push the farmers to buy more shares in order to create more profit for their benefits. Reducing damage to food stores. Another impact of elephant, for instance, in Ilungwa Game Reserve, if you travel to go in Ilungwa, you can find that there is a high level of interaction between human being and wildlife, because there is no any buffer zone which separates between game reserve and the village lands. So it is a big problem in that area. And you can find that the elephants tend to break out of food store to access maize during dry season. So it is our plan for us to do a trial on paddy improved crop food storage. This is called PITS. And we are planning also to do a trial on chick briquettes. This is the combination of elephant dung and chick powder. And when this ignited, it produces a smoke which is harmful to human beings as well to elephants. So we think that it will be a best way to keep elephants away from farmlands, and the problem is going to be reduced.
Maybe just something to add about the chili briquettes is that the reason we've said here implementation needs to be well planned is, as Maria mentioned, the smoke is quite powerful. And so you can't have this too close to households. So we've been trialing on elephant trails out of the game reserve and into villages, but away from households. So that's why we say it needs to be well planned. Just to add something about pigs, the reason why we're trialing them, pigs were designed basically to reduce diseases and damage to insects of stored crops. Pigs are completely sealed, so they don't have any air in them. So what we think is that elephants might not smell crops if they're stored inside pigs, and if they can't smell crops, then maybe they won't break into food stores. But one challenge is that pigs are 5,000 shillings compared to a normal guinea, which is usually about 500 shillings. So we have to test this first before we can implement this with farmers more widely. All right, so briefly some lessons learned from our work. We have found that beehive fences have reduced elephant visits to farms, but we are also aware that they may not work in every context. Beekeeping has its challenges, and not every environment is friendly for it. And one of the challenges, of course, in farming scenarios is pesticides and water. And we tend to work in places where there is enough natural habitat remaining, so putting fences either in or near remaining woodland. Beekeeping requires investment and capacity building, and it takes time for beehives to become occupied and for significant yields of honey to be made. And so it's not it means that we also have to manage expectations about incomes from beekeeping. But even with yields being slow to grow, they do continue to be an incentive for farmers to maintain beehive fences. As Maria mentioned, VSLAs have proved a popular mechanism for income generation. It was sort of our solution to the fact that beekeeping is seasonal and that you don't have cash flow from beekeeping all of the time. What VSLAs do is it allows people to access loans and use that cash for small business. We've had people use their loans to set up small restaurants or purchase solar electricity, solar power equipment, and the other thing that we were thinking about with the SLAs was they also have a social insurance component. So people pay into a social insurance fund and then can make requests in case they have some kind of emergency. Now we were wondering or hoping that maybe this would sort of start to be a crop insurance scheme that would be locally run. But we found that at the moment the main requests that are being allowed by the group are for real emergencies like a death in the family, for instance. So there may be potential here though to build in the future some kind of locally based crop insurance schemes instead of compensation, for instance, or conservation. Beehive fences also cost something and they require input at the start. So especially for areas where elephant impacts aren't high, there are occasional incursions of elephants into village lands. That's where we aren't working yet, but we can't ignore them either. And so we need to think about lower cost, sort of simple methods that farmers can use to reduce elephant impacts. And one thing that we're interested in doing more research into is seeing whether elephants have crop preferences in our study areas and whether we can use that to inform how farmers plant. I think greater awareness raising about the causes of HEC is also very important. And I think we've all talked a lot about sort of these micro-scale approaches, so what you do at a local level to try and reduce impacts from elephants or other species. But we also need to think about the bigger picture, about the causes of conflict. And one of them, is changing land use. And so, especially in southern Tanzania, where we see that a lot of the elephant impacts are in corridor areas, I think we need to think more about corridors and whether we can allow movement of elephants while protecting farmland. I think another aspect of that is how people are able to use their land. So at the moment, land legislation here doesn't really allow for the same kinds of activities maybe that are allowed in Kenya in terms of benefit generation from wildlife or keeping wildlife on land. And I think that is a long-term challenge for Tanzania. We may have to look at some legal matters. And then the last thing I wanted to mention maybe was, I don't know if anyone's ever thought or approached insurance companies about, are there ways for people to insure their livestock or insure their crops that don't involve compensation? It's a question and I don't know if anyone has any answers. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, Oh, there's another one here. Maybe that's it.
Any questions? Yeah. Josephine, for the chili bricks, when you're going to light those up, when do you choose to do that? Like, is it when to then observe the area and you're doing it productively, like in the evening or something? Or?
So we know what time elephants are active, and that's starting from the evening. So then we light them at 5 o'clock, basically on a trail. And from about 6, 7, they start moving. But you need, it's important to have data on elephant activity patterns. So you can do that with camera traps. That's sort of the easiest, safest way. And then so you can light them as well before elephants start moving. Depending on the size of the briquette, on the wind, they can be lit up to 8 hours. So they are active, for a large part of the night. And camera traps are an important part of monitoring how elephants react to chili briquettes as well. You can see sort of at what distance they respond to them. Yeah.
Mine is not a question, it's a comment on the last comments you made about insurance. I think in Kenya we have toyed with the idea of that insurance scheme.
Yeah.
For apparently they toyed, especially with the cattle and drought. And for our wildlife case, it's something that we do for quite some time. But I don't think it might be very expensive because at the end of the day we pay for the premiums. And the insurance follows the business and also have to do the risk assessment. And so that if you're in an area where you have the high likelihood of either the animals being eaten or the crops being destroyed by wildlife,
Yeah.
and the premiums are very high, then the conversation would not be who does pay the premium. So at the end of the day, it might not be taxed. I don't know.
So you think insurance companies would not be interested in venturing into something like this because it's too expensive for them, too high risk?
Yes, unless they also get quite
Yeah. No? Okay.